1851. The air hangs heavy with smoke. Thousands of warriors stand in silence, their weapons steady, eyes locked forward. But these aren't men. They are women. At the front, Se Dong Hong Bei raises her sword. 6,000 voices follow her cry. And just like that, they charge. This moment would be buried by time. But those who saw it never forgot. For over 2 centuries, the Kingdom of Dahomey in West Africa trained the most feared female warriors the world has ever seen. Known by outsiders as Amazons, they weren't mythical, they were real. They fought like shadows, they struck like lightning, they lived without fear, and they died without hesitation. But who were they really? Were they freedom fighters, tools of a brutal empire, victims of a world that never gave them a choice? History rarely tells the stories of women, and when it does, it often gets it wrong. This isn't just the story of an army, it's the story of resistance, of power, of sacrifice, of women who lived by the blade and vanished without a trace. And now we're going to bring them back. Before there were Amazons, there was only ambition. In the early 1600s, a small West African kingdom began rising through the jungle-covered heart of what is now Benin. It was called Dahomey, and it had one goal: survival through strength. Surrounded by powerful enemies like the Oyo Empire in the north and the coastal kingdoms profiting from European trade, Dahomey had no coastline, no gold, no natural advantage. What it had was hunger. Hunger for dominance, for order, for respect. Its founder, King Huagbadja, laid the first stones. He centralized power, built walls, and carved out a kingdom from chaos. But it was his grandson, King Agaja, who turned Dahomey into a military machine. He reorganized society around conquest. Tribute flowed into Abomey, the capital, in the form of cattle, cloth, captives. Neighboring tribes began to fall one by one. But conquest wasn't enough. Agaja knew that internal control was just as important as external expansion. That's when women entered the picture. At first, it wasn't about creating an army. It was about loyalty, protection. Inside the palace, tensions ran high. Rival wives, nobles, potential assassins. So Agaja began training women as guards, trusted, unmarried, devoted only to the king. But soon, those guards started to outshine the men. They were faster, fiercer, more disciplined, and above all, they were loyal in ways no man could be, because their lives belonged to the kingdom. They had no husbands, no families, no distractions. They were forged into tools of the state. As Dahomey expanded, the need for soldiers grew, and these women were ready. What began as palace guards evolved into a full-blown military unit. And over time, they became something no one in the region had ever seen before: a standing, state-backed female army. By the 18th century, these women were no longer just a curiosity. They were a core part of Dahomey's rise to power. Other kings watched in disbelief. European traders recorded their movements with fascination and fear. What kind of kingdom trains women to kill? What kind of society celebrates them as heroes? The answer was Dahomey. And they weren't done rising yet. Not every girl in Dahomey was born to be a warrior, but any girl could become one. The path to becoming an Amazon didn't start on a battlefield. It started with a choice. Sometimes it was the girl's own, but more often it was someone else's. Some were offered by their families, seen as gifts of loyalty to the king. Others were taken as tribute from conquered tribes. Many were orphans, with no ties to the outside world. And some were former slaves, given a second life through violence. Once selected, their old identity ended. No names, no past, no family. Only one title remained: Daughter of the King. For some, it was terrifying. For others, it was freedom. In a world where women were expected to bear children and stay silent, the Amazons were given weapons instead of husbands. They lived behind palace walls, trained by the kingdom's most brutal instructors. Their lives were regulated down to the second. Eat, train, fight, sleep, repeat. Friendships were rare. Attachments were discouraged. Emotion was dangerous. But within that strict discipline, something unexpected happened. They formed a bond, not of blood, but of survival. They bled together. They trained together. They watched each other fall, and they picked each other up. Over time, the weakest were cut from the ranks. Some were sent away. Others vanished without explanation. But those who remained became something else entirely. Each woman was stripped of her given name and given a warrior name instead. Names like the Viper, She Who Kills First, Storm of Knives. These weren't nicknames. They were promises, warnings, legacies in the making. They were not allowed to marry. They were forbidden to bear children. Their bodies did not belong to them. They belonged to the kingdom. Outsiders couldn't understand it. European observers wrote about these women with shock and disbelief. How can a woman kill without remorse? They asked. They didn't realize. These women had been taught not just to fight, but to forget. To forget softness. To forget fear. To forget what the world expected of them. They weren't just born into battle. They were sculpted for it. There was no easing into it. From the moment they entered the compound, they were no longer girls. They were soldiers in training, whether they were ready or not. The training ground was sacred, brutal, feared even by the instructors. Here, failure wasn't punished. It was erased. Every day began before the sun. Barefoot runs through thorned fields, climbing wooden walls with bloodied hands, carrying heavy stones in the midday heat. Not to build strength, but to destroy limits. They didn't train to survive. They trained to conquer. Weapons weren't tools. They were extensions of the body. Each Amazon learned to master the machete, the spear, and the musket. They trained to kill in silence, in chaos, in pain. They practiced slashing targets while blindfolded. Some were dropped into pits and told to fight their way out. Others were tested in ways no one spoke of. Only those who passed remained. And then there were the final tests. Some recruits were taken into the courtyard and handed a prisoner, often a condemned enemy. The command was simple: kill. No hesitation, no questions. It wasn't cruelty, it was loyalty. If you paused, you were weak. And weakness had no place among the Amazons. Instructors watched silently, not for skill, but for silence. Did she flinch? Did her hand tremble? Did her eyes water? If yes, she was removed. If no, she was ready. But there was more than just blood. There was a code. Amazons took vows. No marriage, no children, no lovers. They belonged only to the king, and through him, to the kingdom. Some were proud of this. Others carried it like a chain. They ate separately from the rest of society. They had their own rituals, their own songs, their own way of walking. They moved in unison, shoulder to shoulder, blade to blade. One heartbeat, one army. They were rewarded for loyalty, gold, cloth, status. But even at the height of power, their lives were not their own. Any sign of disobedience meant punishment, whipping, isolation, sometimes worse. And yet, they endured. Because behind every scar was a belief that they were more than women, that they were weapons, that they were legend in the making. Some recruits broke. Others rose. Those who remained were transformed forever, not by the blade in their hands, but by the voice in their heads that whispered, "You feel nothing. You fear nothing. You fail no one." Once they were forged into warriors, The battlefield became their home. The Amazons didn't march into war. They stormed into it. They didn't rely on numbers. They relied on fear. Before any attack, their chants would echo through the forests, low at first, then building into a deafening roar. The sound alone sent enemies fleeing, but it wasn't just for show. It was calculated. Psychological warfare. Their formations were tight, their movements coordinated. They struck in waves, fast, fluid, and savage. Scouts moved first, crawling through the underbrush with knives in their teeth. Then came the flankers, attacking from both sides. By the time the main force arrived, the enemy was already broken. They climbed fortress walls with bare hands. They charged head-on into musket fire. They fought in total silence until the killing blow. And they didn't just fight men, they humiliated them. Many male enemies were found dismembered, their heads displayed as warnings. Their specialty? Close combat. With machetes raised high, they aimed for the throat, the gut, the spine. One Amazon was said to have killed 5 soldiers in under a minute, barehanded after her blade broke. Their deadliest campaign came in 1851. Led by Saedong Hongbei herself, 6,000 Amazons marched on the Egba stronghold of Abeokuta, a city protected by thick walls, European guns, and warriors with nothing to lose. The battle was a bloodbath. The Amazons reached the gates under heavy fire. They used ladders, ropes, even bodies to climb the walls. They breached the defenses, but it wasn't enough. The Egba were ready. Traps had been laid. Snipers waited in towers. By nightfall, hundreds of Amazons lay dead. Some were captured, some burned alive. But even in defeat, the stories spread. They had charged into hell and nearly won. And then came the final chapter. France. In the 1890s, the French Empire turned its eyes toward Dahomey. Gold, land, power. The Amazons were the last wall standing between France and full colonial control. In 1890, war broke out. The French had rifles, cannons, Maxim machine guns. The Amazons had blades, muskets, and fury. They fought like demons, launching ambushes, cutting off supply lines, dragging soldiers into the jungle one by one. They killed with silence, and they died without begging. French generals wrote about them in disbelief. We have never faced anything like them. But bravery isn't always enough. The French brought reinforcements. They burned villages. They broke the kingdom from the inside. By 1892, Dahomey fell. Its king surrendered. The Amazons, what was left of them, were scattered. Some were executed. Some escaped. Some simply disappeared. And with them, the last true female army in history was gone. They weren't defeated in a single day. Dahomey fell slowly, like a mighty tree cut at the roots, collapsing under its own weight. The French came with modern weapons, rifles, artillery, machine guns, but that wasn't their deadliest weapon. It was time. They wore the kingdom down, burned villages, broke alliances, starved the people. And one by one, the Amazons began to vanish, not from battle, but from the silence that followed it. By 1892, the capital, Dahomey, was captured. The king surrendered, and with him, so did the last hope of the warrior women who had protected him for generations. Some Amazons were executed, others were imprisoned, and a few simply faded into the jungle, never seen again. The ones who survived were changed. Without a kingdom, without purpose, without a war, they were lost. Women trained only for death, now forced to live in a world that had no place for them. Some became laborers. Some lived in hiding. Some were mocked as relics of a savage past. And some were taken, put on ships, displayed in European cities like curiosities. Human exhibits, not warriors, not soldiers, just strange women from Africa who once carried knives. But the truth couldn't be displayed in a cage. because behind every scar was a story. A friend lost in the smoke of battle. A scream heard through the jungle. A name remembered only in silence. One woman remained to tell it. Her name was Nawi. In the 1970s, researchers found her in a village in Benin. She was over 100 years old, frail, wrinkled, nearly blind. But her voice was strong, her memories clear. She spoke of the training, the battles, the blood, and the sisters who never came home. She died in 1979. With her, the last living echo of the Dahomey Amazons faded into history. But even now, their story survives, not because history preserved it, but because it refuses to die. In the whispers of old songs, in the strength of daughters, in the defiance of any woman who dares to fight back. We remember Sparta. We remember Troy. But why not Dahomey? Why not the women who were called monsters, just because they dared to be powerful? History doesn't erase women like them. It only hides them. But now, we've seen them. We've heard them. And we won't forget. You've been watching Execution Detective, where the past never stays silent. Subscribe for more forgotten warriors, lost empires, and buried truths. Because some stories are too powerful to stay in the shadows.